You set your alarm for 6 in the morning. You had a plan, a list, a version of the day that made sense when you wrote it down the night before, and then the alarm went off, and something happened. Not tiredness exactly, not sadness exactly, something heavier than both. A grey weightlessness, where nothing felt worth the effort of beginning. So you lay there. And the longer you lay there, the louder the voice got. The one that has been calling you the same name for years. Lazy, undisciplined, broken, weak. But what if that voice is wrong? What if what you are feeling has nothing to do with laziness at all? What if it has a completely different name, rooted not in your character, but in something far older and far more serious? What if you are not lazy? What if you are philosophically exhausted? This is not a motivational reframe. This is not a way of letting yourself off the hook. This is a diagnosis that some of the most rigorous thinkers in human history spent their entire lives trying to name. And understanding it may be the most important thing you do for yourself this year. Philosophical exhaustion is the specific and deeply human experience of moving through your days without a personal philosophy to anchor meaning to your actions. It is not burnout in the clinical sense, though it can look identical from the outside. It is not depression, though it shares several of its shadows. It is something more foundational. It is what happens when a person loses, or never builds, a coherent answer to the question that sits underneath every single thing they do. Why does this matter? Friedrich Nietzsche understood this better than almost anyone. He wrote that a person who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. That is not motivational poster wisdom. It is a precise observation about the architecture of human endurance. When you know why you are doing something, the difficulty of doing it becomes bearable, even meaningful. When you do not know why, even easy things feel impossible. The alarm goes off and your body refuses because somewhere beneath the surface, something in you cannot locate a reason good enough to justify getting up. That is not laziness. That is a philosophical crisis wearing the costume of a personality flaw. Aristotle had a word for the state of living in alignment with your deepest purpose. He called it eudaimonia. It is often translated as happiness, but that translation misses something important. Eudaimonia is not the feeling of being happy. It is the experience of flourishing, functioning fully in accordance with what you actually value. When you are in eudaimonia, you do not need to force yourself to begin. The beginning comes naturally because the action is connected to something genuinely yours. When you are not in eudaimonia, every task feels like pushing a door locked from the inside. Most people are living inside a philosophy they did not choose, a philosophy assembled from their parents' expectations, their culture's definition of success, the algorithm's version of who they should want to be. They are working toward goals that were handed to them rather than discovered. And somewhere in the body, below conscious thought, the system knows the difference. The exhaustion you feel is not your body refusing to work. It is your body refusing to perform a life that does not belong to you. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and spent the rest of his life studying how human beings maintain the will to live under impossible conditions, called this the existential vacuum. He observed that people who lack a personal sense of meaning do not simply feel bored or unmotivated. They feel a particular hollowness that no amount of rest, entertainment, or success can fill. He watched accomplished people collapse into this vacuum not because their lives were objectively difficult, but because they had never stopped to ask what their lives were actually for. You might recognize this. You might have had moments where everything on the outside was technically fine. The job was adequate. The relationships were functional. The apartment was warm. And yet something felt profoundly wrong, as if you were watching your own life through a window rather than living inside it. That distance is not a sign that something is broken in you. It is a sign that the philosophy you are operating from is not yours. And here is where it becomes urgent. Because the response to philosophical exhaustion in modern culture is almost always the wrong one. When you feel this paralysis, this inability to begin, the world tells you to optimize, to build better habits, to wake up earlier, to download an app, to be more disciplined. And so you try. And it works for a few days. And then the grey weightlessness returns. And you feel worse than before because now you have evidence that you cannot even maintain a habit, which confirms the voice, which deepens the exhaustion. This is the trap. You cannot habit your way out of a philosophical problem. You cannot optimize yourself into a life that does not feel worth living. Discipline is a tool, but a tool needs a direction, and you cannot find the direction by being harder on yourself. You find it by going inward and asking the question that modern productivity culture is terrified of, because it does not have a product to sell you as the answer. What do I actually believe my life is for? Albert Camus called the central problem of human existence the absurd, the collision between your need for meaning and the universe's total silence on the matter. The universe does not hand you a purpose. It does not confirm that what you are doing matters. You have to decide that it does. And the act of deciding, consciously and deliberately, is the only thing that transforms exhaustion into momentum. The Stoics understood this practically. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire while managing illness, grief, and war. Every morning he sat with a journal and rebuilt his philosophy from the ground up. Not because he was naturally disciplined, but because he understood that without that daily reconstruction, the weight of existence would flatten him. He was not more motivated than you. He was more intentional about the question of why. Think about the last time you were genuinely absorbed in something. Not forced productivity, genuinely absorbed, where time moved differently and the effort did not feel like effort. Whatever that was, it was connected to a value you hold so deeply it needs no external justification. That moment of absorption is what eudaimonia feels like. And the distance between that moment and your average day is the exact size of the philosophical gap you are living in. So, what do? Not a list of habits, something harder and more important. You sit with the question, repeatedly, over days and weeks, until the answer begins to take shape. What do you actually value beneath the values you were handed? What would you do if no one was watching? What kind of person are you trying to become? Not according to anyone else, but you. What would make the alarm feel like an invitation rather than a sentence? These are not comfortable questions, but the act of asking them, the deliberate, sustained act of building your own answer, is the only genuine cure for philosophical exhaustion. Everything else is delay. And here is what happens when you begin to find that answer, even partially. The grey weightlessness does not disappear overnight, but it starts to feel less like paralysis and more like a signal. A reminder that you have drifted. A nudge back toward the question, and slowly the question becomes a compass, and the compass gives the alarm clock a reason, and the reason gives the day a direction. You were never lazy. You were living inside a borrowed life without a philosophy to make it yours. And the distance between where you are and where you want to be is not a measure of your discipline. It is a measure of how long it has been since you asked the most important question a human being can ask. You set your alarm again tonight. Tomorrow morning, it will go off. And for the first time, instead of reaching for a reason someone else gave you, you might reach for your own. That is not a small thing. That is, in the most literal sense, the beginning of a philosophy. And a philosophy is the only thing that has ever truly moved a human being to rise.